So I gave you a list, and I put logos and telos. We don't, Greek words of the day. We're doing the logos to telos. These are all, well, some of them are Greek documents that we're going to talk about. I gave you a freebie, a double freebie. So this, I want to talk about the Archko documents. You say, what are the Archko documents? We'll get into that. The reason they're called Archko, I don't know. I may get a clue from my thing, but no one's ever asked that question before, which is interesting. It was named by the person who was the translator. I'll tell you, we got them. I gave you a list of the Archko documents. So first of all, it's called the Archko volume, the Archaeological Writings of the Sanhedrin, Talmud of the Jews, and it has the list. Constantine's letter in regard to having 50 copies of the scriptures written and bound. Jonathan's interview with the Bethlehem shepherds. The letter of Melchior, priest of the synagogue at Bethlehem. Gamaliel's interview with Mary and Joseph and others concerning Jesus. The report of Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin concerning the execution of Jesus. The report of Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Balaeus' notes, Acte Pilate, or Pilate's report to Caesar on the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. Herod Antipas' defense before the Roman Senate in regard to his conduct at Bethlehem. Herod Antipas' defense before the Roman Senate in regard to the execution of John the Baptist. The Hillel letters regarding God's providence to the Jews by Hillel III. And then the Gospels. He used the Gospels. The Proevangelion, the first infancy Gospel, Thomas's infancy Gospel, the Gospel of Nicodemus, the Acts of Pontius Pilate, the Gospel of Peter, the Signs Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Secret Gospel of Mark, the Egerton Gospel, Gospel of Oxyrhynchus, 840, Gospel of Oxyrhynchus, 1224, the Gospel of Judas. In addition, the additionally mentioned up to 400 AD, none of these are extant. All these below it and to the right are not extant. In other words, we don't have any copies of these. Gospel of Andrews, Apelles, according to the 12 apostles, Barnabas, Bartholomew, Basilidus, Encrantes, Eve, the Hebrews, the false gospel of Eschlaus, the gospel of Jude, false gospels published by Lucantus, Marcion's gospel, Matthias' gospel, Matthias' gospel, the gospel according to the Nazarenes, the gospel of perfection, the false gospel of Peter, the gospel of Philip, the gospel of Cervantes, and the gospel of the Ebionites. And you say, well, how do we know about these gospels if we don't have them? Because they're mentioned in the apostolic fathers. They're mentioned in other documents. So someone wrote these gospels. They were popular, they were passed around, the apostolic fathers wrote about them, quoted from them, but we don't have them. So if you're an archaeologist, what's that guy, who's the guy, the archaeologist that goes and finds all that stuff? Indiana Jones? Why isn't Indiana Jones looking for the Gospels, huh? He looked for he found the Ark of the Covenant, right? He found all this stuff. Why didn't he look?
Grail even.
You know? The Holy Grail, right? Why isn't he looking for these Gospels? I mean,
be a whole bunch of episodes.
Yeah. If you found one of these, man, you'd be like the hero of the world.
Yeah, Harrison Ford isn't going to last that long.
Yeah, you don't think so?
He does bring his airplane here. Doesn't his airplane get
Yes,
here?
The airplane does.
The very first one you mentioned intrigued me. Jonathan's interview with the Bethlehem shepherds.
Yeah.
Who's Jonathan in this?
Jonathan is a rabbi, but one of the Sanhedrin.
So he's not CNN News Network or anything like that?
Not CNN News Network. So let's talk about this. How do we get this document? And this is the Archko volume. I have a copy. You can probably get it on the internet. It's probably a freebie because the translations was way past 60 years. I'll tell you about the time. But this Archko document, I'm going to give you about it. Okay, I can't read it to you, but you might want to read it yourself.
That has all these things in it, that little book?
This document has all those in the in that list up to the Gospels.
Oh.
Yes, they're all in there. Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, they're not long documents.
Yeah, where'd you pick that? Where'd you acquire that at? You probably had it for 30 years.
I have. I have. I'm a bookophile. I'm a bookaholic, okay? So when I wander around in bookstores or in Bible bookstores or wherever I go, I'm always looking for the ones that are hidden, right? The ones that are way back in the corner that no one has bought. I think this probably sat in the bookstore for, it's like I said, I'll say it again, okay? Why don't the synagogues definitely don't, but why don't the seminaries teach about this stuff? It's not canonical. Why would you teach about this when you got the whole Bible, right? 27 books of New Testament. Why don't the universities teach about this? Because it proves Jesus Christ. Oh boy, that would be bad, wouldn't it? Anyway, I found that, I think you could find these on the internet. I think you might be able to find the whole Archko document in the Gutenberg project. How do we get them? Okay, this is how we got them. The Reverend W.D. Mann of DeWitt, Missouri. He was a preacher and educated in Greek and Latin. He went over to Germany. He visited H.C. Windendam of Germany. And I don't know I don't know if he was a Lutheran pastor or what. He probably could have been because he's from Missouri and going to Germany, right? He went in 1856. And the German professor that he was with, the professor he was with, who knew Latin and Greek, basically reported that he had gone to the Vatican Library, where among the 5,000 or 560,000 volumes, the Vatican Library, you guys have been to it, right? Oh, no. The Library of Congress, we don't know how many documents are in the Vatican Library. Can you imagine how many documents there are in the Vatican Library and what they are? Okay, the Pope has been collecting stuff since when?
A long time.
Since Peter was a Pope, right? Or, that was in Antioch. He's been collecting for a long time, from the beginning, right? And pieces, parts, and documents, and scrolls, and codexes. And he probably stole it from the Medicis, right? You know what I'm talking about?
The Medicis were popes too.
And the Medicis were popes having kids, too. Exactly. You got it. As a matter of fact, why don't they teach us this stuff, right? All you do when you learn about Western history and civilization, what do they do? You know, they gloss over everything, and then you got all these popes. I mean, there's bunches of them, right? Hundreds of these popes. But yet, they never teach you much about it, right? But you know what they're doing. You ever been to the Vatican Museum? I've been to the Vatican Museum more times than I care to speak because it's a really cool museum, but it's like all museums. You see them once, you go, okay, cool. But the Vatican Museum is full of stuff, millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars probably worth of archaeological and art. Amazing art, okay? Mostly Christian art. Cool stuff. But back in 1856, okay? Now the Vatican has parts of their library. And I don't know all the parts because, okay, Brown is a dope. The guy who wrote the, what's that thing? The Da Vinci Code, right? But if you read Brown, I need to read Brown to find out, but he may have made it up, or he just may have, but we do know this. The Vatican has parts of their library that they do not let the average person ever see. Matter of fact, they're not going to let you see some of the really good stuff for lots of reasons. But we do know we got majority text and other stuff from the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library has full of cool stuff. But they have sections, and they have private sections, they have archaeological sections, they have stuff that you probably, you got to be part of the crowd. So if you're not a cardinal, you're probably not going to see it. But anyway, this guy from Germany, there was a time when lots of scholars went to the Vatican Library, and they still do, to study the stuff there. There's all kinds of cool stuff. This guy, this Windem, he went to the Vatican Library, and he looked through, not all 560,000 volumes, but he looked through many of the volumes, and he happened to find a record concerning Pilate. So what he did is he made a translation for this guy Mahan. Through research, Mahan went to the Vatican Library. And Mahan found, okay, Once this Wynham guy told him, I found a letter concerning Pilate, and I made a translation, and here it is. So what would you do? Well, if you're, a Latin Greek dude, you would go to the Vatican Library and start looking. And that's what he did. This is before the Vatican Library sealed off a lot of their stuff. Why do you think they didn't care at first?
They were probably happy to get free scholarship from somebody else.
Well, that may be true. I think the big deal is they didn't care because the only people who could speak Latin and Greek, generally, who were interested in the Vatican Library were
Catholics?
Catholic priests and other scholars, right? Because all right, have you heard of the divide of the Reformation?
And this was 1856, there wasn't even a telegraph.
This is 1856. Yeah, exactly. There was, I think telegraph were just since
Barely the infancy of
barely the infancy of communication, right? You're right on. But the Lutherans, okay. If you're Lutheran and you go in the Vatican, what is going to happen to you?
Somebody will be escorting you all the time.
Well, probably you're not going because when you come back and you tell your congregation, hey, or your seminary, I went to the Vatican, and they go, are you Catholic? Right? And how about the evangelicals in the United States of America, which I think is a real downfall for America. Most of them couldn't speak Latin or Greek and didn't care. Well, the educated ones could, but we have a problem. Natty Bumppo, right? Remember Natty Bumppo and the proselytizer in Natty Bumppo, who had never read the Bible, never had a copy of the Bible, but quoted the Bible, but he didn't quote it right. You know what I'm talking about, right? In Fenimore Cooper, right? So I'm just saying, there's an issue here. 1856, the world is as sophisticated as it is today, but there are deep divides, and there's even deep divides today. Have you noticed? There are divides, okay, between people and what they think about stuff. I try to be, the pastor was talking about an adapter, right? I'd like to be an adapter to help you see the Catholic view and the Baptist view as well as the Lutheran view. So maybe we can, I think we should all kind of have a more open ideas to see what this is. So Mahan went to the Vatican and he found a whole bunch of these documents. Well, a whole bunch. He found these. And then he went to another place in Christianity because he was piqued. If you find some of this in the Vatican, where's the other place you might find them? Do you know?
Are you thinking Jerusalem or, not
Alexandria.
What?
Alexandria there?
Oh, I thought somebody said it.
Antioch?
Greek Orthodox, and where was the Greek Orthodox? Where is the Greek Orthodox was centered?
Well, Constantinople, but wasn't it like sacked by the Turks and stuff? And what would they have left? I don't know.
Okay, well,
Istanbul?
I'm going to say something that's slightly politically incorrect today, but when the Muslims sacked Constantinople, and before they changed it into Istanbul, basically they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they didn't even know what they had. So they basically left most of it alone. Only later in the modern era did they did they take the Hagia Sophia and turn it into a museum and basically desecrate it. They didn't desecrate it because they were, there's a great deal of ignorance in.
What do you mean by desecrated? Because they turned it into a mosque and painted over the Christian paintings and stuff like that.
Later, yeah. Originally, they had a very pagan respect. There was a great pagan respect among the Islamic community for the religious objects of Christianity, because they viewed them two ways. Number one, they viewed that they were Christ is a prophet in Islam. So they did not desecrate it for that reason. There were two other reasons they didn't desecrate it. The other reason was they were very ignorant and paganistic, and so they had very strong spiritual reasons for not doing it, because they believed it would bring lasting shame and cursing on them. The other reason was because at the time they were very concerned that the Western world would retaliate. we've proven the Western world will not retaliate to protect its own self, so it won't, it won't protect its treasures either. So for a long time, Constantine had a library, and the library of the Hagia Sophia was filled with Christian documents. Where they are, I have no idea. I suspect that they were burned or put in a cesspool or something, but in 1856, Mahan went to Constantinople, and basically went through the library and found a bunch of Talmudic documents. That's why it says the archaeological writings of the Sanhedrin, the Talmuds of the Jews, because he found a bunch of Mishnah and Talmudic written. The Mishnah is not written down until the Talmud, but he found a whole bunch of these Talmudic documents and Jewish documents. So I don't believe he translated himself, but in 1883, Mahan visited, he went to the Vatican into Constantinople in the company of Dr. McIntosh and Dr. Twyman, and they both went to the Vatican and to the Jewish Talmuds at Constantinople. Jewish synagogues were big time in that time in Turkey, in that area. There they discovered the manuscripts and they translated them with McIntosh and Twyman. So this started in 1856. By 1883, they were basically they found all of these documents plus some others, and they were doing that. So the first thing we should ask is veracity, right? The bibliographical test. The bibliographical test. And here we have the problem. You know what the problem is, right? What's the problem with the bibliographical test?
It can be referenced somewhere else.
You gotta trace the authenticity of those documents, is that where you're?
Well, let me remind you. Okay, the bibliographical test is this. Let me see. I always get in trouble for not having good pens. But the bibliographical test, there are two, right? Number of manuscripts, and number two, that's one. And number two is the recency, or the time between, see, how do I draw that? The time between written, when it's written, and the copy. The time, this time difference, right?
I thought it was time between event and writing.
Time between event and writing, that is whether it's primary or secondary, and you're right, that's probably part of the bibliographical test, which is, that would be a 3, which is what we call the primacy of witness. And I'm not sure if I taught that as internal or bibliographical. I think that's more internal, but whatever. In the bibliographical, you're looking at the actual writing, right? And you're saying, how many manuscripts do I have? Well, how many manuscripts do you think they found?
One?
Yeah, one of each. That's the problem. They found one of each of these. They went through the Vatican and they found these. So, for example, of Hebrews, how many did I tell you we have? Like 600 or something in the original Greek, right? In Greek. So there are copies that were made within about 200 years, because the earliest we have are the early codexes from about 200 AD, in that period, the 1st century, the 2nd century. But the big deal is that we have lots of those copies. But of these documents, we have maybe 1 or 2, which is what? Is that common in the ancient world?
I would imagine so.
Yeah. That's horribly common. That's terribly common. That we may have, one document of, for example, some of Pliny, or Pliny the Elder, some documents, we have singular documents that some guy in Britain, nobility, has in their library, right? And if we can find a second one, we really want that, because what can we do? Compare them, compare what we have, right? And most of those documents, there's hundreds of years between them. Now, we don't know, because we only have those documents, and by the way, you know what happened to the documents, right? The Vatican didn't let Mahan have them. They're still in the Vatican. And the problem was that after Mahan, I love this guy. He's the one, he found the documents with these other gentlemen, and they translated the documents. But after they came out with the Archko volume, what do you think happened?
Vatican closed the door.
The Vatican said, no more. You can't, we're not letting you in.
Well,
So
that begs the question, why though? I mean, if these are historical documents and they prove Jesus' historicity or whatever, why would they lock them up? What's in the secret library that they don't want us to know?
The Vatican has manuscripts that they won't affirm or deny because they're known to hold back questionable or embarrassing stuff.
Right.
And that's what they
So
did.
why do they keep embarrassing stuff at all?
Because it's historical. Because, see, this goes back to what I said before. The Reformers said that the New Testament, they selected. You say, why did they select what they did? They selected based on the bibliographical internal external proofs, right? But they selected what they did, and then they said it is inspired. Where the Catholic Church has never held that position at all. The Catholic Church has always said they're historical documents. Yes, sir?
Is my understanding that the Catholic Church believes that the New Testament is, as you say, is historical, but the Old Testament is inspired?
When we get to the Torah, we'll talk about there are issues with the Old Testament. Remember, and I'll do a quick sideline, because this is really kind of important. The Jews believe that Moses brought the entire Torah down on the 2 slabs of stone. Matter of fact, it
Awfully
says
tiny
that.
writing.
What's that?
That'd have to be awfully tiny writing.
Well, it's mnemonics. Remember, it's mnemonics.
Still, even so, the whole 5 books of the Torah, even without vowels or whatever, it's still.
Well,
They-
the whole point is that God had laser engraved them in the stone.
That may be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You read
Well,
them in like
actually,
6-point font.
well, when we look at the Torah, we will see that the Hebrew says in it, in the Torah, that Moses brought down the Torah on the tablets. Remember, the first time God made it for him and laser cut him, and then he broke them, right? And then he went up and he had to chisel it the second time. It's like punishment tour, right? So he was doing the laser engraving on the second shot. But the reason there's an issue, you know what the problem is, right? Don't you? Primacy. Primacy of witness. Who saw Genesis 1 through 20-something, 27, I think. Right? Who saw it?
Only God, or Adam and Eve.
Yeah, at
No
what
one
point
was
was it
still
recorded?
alive
Was it
then.
oral histories passed down until it was at some point recorded?
Yeah, we'll get into the detail, but you have a problem. If it's oral history, what's the problem with oral history?
No eyewitnesses are still alive.
Right, and it could be myth. It could be like the myth, right? If it's oral history, it's myth. On the other hand, if it's a declarative document, like God wrote it and gave it to him, what does that suddenly make it? Pick the word, inspired. Right? And so one of the reasons that the Jews called them inspired, and we did too, was because the primacy of witness is really difficult to prove. There are other bibliographical issues that we'll talk about in Torah. I guess I'll mention it. Okay. I'm giving it away, but I'll give it away again. We'll do it again. But remember, what did they do to an old Torah scroll? They destroyed them. They destroyed the old Torah scrolls. They burned them, okay, intentionally, after they were copied. It was an intentional thing because they saw them as sacred. So what happens to your bibliographical tests? You lose your manuscripts, right? The only reason, the only reason we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Because they didn't destroy them. They put them in a cave, thing. But every other Torah scroll, and the reason we know there's differences between the Masoretic texts and the older text is because of those. See, there's huge things in this. But the reason the Jews declared, and then we declared, Christians declared, Paul writes about it, inspired was because of some of these issues. The New Testament, you don't have to. Why?
Tons of
Support.
manuscripts, primacy of witness, all that stuff.
Bingo! I can say Matthew, Mark. I can say Matthew saw it. Mark was probably there. Luke saw lots of it, and John was there, right? Paul was there. These people were all there. I don't have to say, well, I saw it in a dream, right?
Right.
Said Revelation and Martin Luther had a problem with that. Anyway, the thing is, the Vatican has them. The Constantinople Talmuds, what happened to them?
Gone.
They're gone because they're probably in a cesspool, because eventually Islam saw that the West was not going to defend the Jews nor defend Constantinople, so they sacked it, destroyed it. The Hagia Sophia is now if you've been there, it's a desecrated church. And it's full of Islamic symbols. So they don't use it, it's a museum. And they allow us to go see it. Isn't that cute? They allow us to go see one of the greatest historical religious sites of Christianity, but that's really cute. That's the way it works. The number of manuscripts is unknown. At least there's one each. We know that from the Vatican. The lapse between the original manuscripts, we don't know. So there are bibliographical problems, right? So this is how we evaluate all documents, right? How many copies? What's the lapse? And we'll get to primary source witness. That's the internal. So the internal contradictions, there are none. If you read them, you'll find they're cohesive and comprehensible. The degree of witness is primary and secondary. They are geographically placed. They're chronologically present. There's nothing in any of the Archko documents to substantially contradict the report of any other document in antiquity or any known archaeological find. There are some problems based on style and presentation. Those are generally not historically considered a problem. So, the bibliographical tests are questionable. The internal and the external, they pass. Are they worth reading? Yeah, I think they're really worth reading, personally. Let's talk about them, okay? So, one of the most interesting ones is, well, I guess we'll get to that point. Constantine's letter in regard to having 50 copies of the scripture written and bound. You know what that was the invention of, right? The Codex, yeah. Because old Constantine basically said, we have these documents. We have the Pauline letters. We have the New Testament documents, and this was about 300 something AD. He said, hey, I want to make 50 copies. 50 copies at $50,000 a piece. Little monks, fingers are moving like this, right? We don't know if they're in Latin or Greek. They were probably in Greek, but they were codexes, and we have some of the codexes. I don't know if they were Latin or Greek. Interesting stuff. So you got Jonathan's interview with the Bethlehem shepherds, the letter of Melchior, the priest of the synagogue at Bethlehem about Jesus, by the way. Gamaliel's interview with Mary and Joseph, others concerning Jesus. Let me see, I'm going to skip, I read those. So, the Talmuds, the Mishnah. The Talmudic documents. There is, we have the Torah, which we will study. It's verse 5. Then we have the Tanakh. The Tanakh are the other documents, the prophets, the Psalms, all those. The verse 5, everything other is called the Tanakh. You have the Tanakh. You have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is also called the Oral Torah. Oral Torah. The Oral Torah was not written down until around 100 AD. We don't know exactly when, but around 100 AD, approximately. There was one written in Jerusalem, and there was one written in Babylon. So you have the Babylonian Talmud, and you have the Jerusalem Talmud. There may have been other Talmuds written, but we don't know, okay? We don't have them extant. The Talmuds, that is what Mahan discovered, was the early Talmuds. Now, the thing about the Talmud is the Talmud includes the Mishnah, and I don't have a picture. The way I have copies of the Talmud, okay? A Talmud page looks like this, and on the Talmud page, in the middle is the Mishnah. The Mishnah is written out in the middle. It's the oral Torah. It's not supposed to be written down. Up on the corner over here is the first commentary on the Mishnah, which is called the Talmud. Okay? It's a commentary on the text of the Mishnah. And around it, I think I can't remember which way it goes. It goes this way or that way. Around it, let's say it's this way. And around it are the Talmudic arguments concerning the Mishnah and the Talmud original commentary. So around it are the arguments by the rabbis. And the arguments are, by the way, they start in Hebrew, they go to Aramaic, there's some German, and there's some French. I don't think there's any Latin in there. But the Talmudic arguments are still going on today, although they kind of stopped Rambam. Rambam is around 1400s, and so Rambam after Rambam, they kind of petered out. So they haven't changed the Talmud a whole lot since then. But when Mahan went to Constantine, he found the Talmudic documents, and he was able to look at them and see them. But they're part of what we'll talk about in Torah. Torah is huge. The big, huge thing is this is a problem in Christianity. Okay, how many Christian scholars studying the Talmuds? I wish there were. We need Christian scholars studying the Talmuds and the Mishnah, because the Talmuds give us all kinds of information about Jesus Christ. Did you know that? When we get into Torah, I think I've got some Torah stuff. I don't know, when we do the Gospels, definitely at some point, I bring those in, and I've talked to you about them before. Talmudic documents that talk about Jesus Christ. Usually disparagingly.
Yeah, they say he was like a sorcerer and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it's cool.
It says that he was doing supernatural stuff.
Yeah, it's cool stuff because, so, this is what I got to. I said it before, I think before class, right? People always ask this question: what other documents other than the Bible talk about Jesus? There's thousands of them in that period. It's just we in the church don't teach them, and the historical world doesn't teach them. The historical world's trying to hide it.
Right, because they back up the Bible.
They back up the Bible. Well, it's just like these Archko documents. You may never ever heard of these before, but they're cool stuff. Right? And yeah, they're questionable, bibliographical, but let's look at this. Okay, external proof. Do you think there were very many reports in the Roman Empire?
That's what is interesting, because that's the governing authority at the time, and they were fairly
they
bureaucratic
need
and
reports and stuff,
organized
yeah.
and disinterested from a religious perspective. They're more about governance.
Yeah.
Take what we have as bureaucratic documents and multiply them times every pilot, every procurator, and every head of a legion, right? There are documents flying. The only reason we don't have documents anymore is because they're flying across the internet. The amount of emails that are going are like crazy. In that era, though, you're right on. They were, Pilate, how often do you think Pilate sent a letter to the Senate?
I don't know, did he owe a periodic report of some kind, annual, or of tax income? This is...
As long as, every time he sent the taxes, right? What do you want to write in that letter?
What you're doing well.
Yeah, look at all the money I got from him. You told me you wanted this much, I gave you this much, right? And you write a letter. This is how I did it. Because, why? Why would you do that?
Secure your position.
Justify your existence.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to be stuck as a procurator of Jerusalem or of Israel for the next 100 years. You want a promotion so you can go back to Rome, right? I mean, this is the way it works. So you're a bureaucrat. These are bureaucrats in foreign countries. They want to get out.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be sent to Gaul.
They definitely don't want to get sent to Gaul. To us, that's part of this French Riviera, but in that era, it's where the bad guys were, right? Who were chopping your throats. So, yeah, precisely. And by the way, Herod Antipas, one of those guys, got sent there. One of the sons of Herod got sent there. I can't remember which one. I didn't put it in my notes. Anyway, so the thing is, we know reports were common. Why don't we have them?
Well, they
Probably some
probably
insignificant.
disintegrated or whatever, got burned or whatever, and no one
Outlived their
copied them,
usefulness.
yeah.
There's been a few wars in Europe since then, to
Well-
destroy things.
Yeah, but even more so, okay, so today, let's say you had a letter. Let's say you found a letter from, some bureaucratic authority in San Francisco in your files, right? Exactly.
Toss it.
You're gonna toss it, you know? Now,
It was in
if
the shredder.
you might shred it, yeah. Your choices today, though, is you could Xerox it, but who would do that, right? In that era, what did you have to do?
Hand copy.
You had to hand copy it. You had to hire somebody at immense cost to hand copy the document. I'm not going to do that. It's a letter. It's a bureaucratic letter from Pilate that's like, let me keep my position, right? Who's going to do that? And,
No copies.
right? Now, it shouldn't surprise you the Vatican has it. Right? Because what did they do? All the emperors? I'm sure, now, you know what the Egyptians did, right? Remember what the Egyptians did? You know what the Egyptians did?
Bury you with your stuff?
No, not so much. But when you croaked, they took all your names and they wiped them off and rewrote them, right? We see this all the time. They would wipe out the history of the previous pharaoh. And so all the documents were probably destroyed because they mentioned the previous pharaoh. Because who cared about those guys? But the Romans were different, right? The Romans and Greeks were different. The Greeks kept it just because they thought it was cool to have around. But the Romans, why did they keep it?
If they were
Because they were
bureaucrats.
bureaucrats.
They're bureaucratic nutsos. Look, they give us the Latin language that didn't change. It's a dead language, and people are still using it today for prescriptions. Hope you don't get a bad one. The thing is that you could see Constantine, right? And his mother saying, hey, should we throw this out? And he goes, oh no, that's only 500 years old. Have it recopied, right? And so who got all that stuff? The popes. The Vatican Library got all this stuff. They have it. There may be even more stuff in there. So, think about this. Tertullian and Justin Martyr both wrote about a report of the crucifixion that's not extant, sent by Pilate to Tiberius. Okay? Do you hear what I said? Tertullian and Justin Martyr both speak of a report of the crucifixion that's not extant that was sent from Pilate to Tiberius. Guess what happened because of that? You know what happened, right? You know what happened? We're not talking about the non... not apocryphal, what do you call them? The analogia. We're not talking about analogia. We're not talking about stuff, but what do you think suddenly happened? Somebody wrote the letter, and you can find it. There is, no kidding, a letter in history that was purportedly written by Pilate to Tiberius. But we know it's not historically accurate, because we only have a Latin copy, and we know it was written back in the medieval period. It's analogia. It's not, and you say, why would people do that?
It was fabricated, likely fabricated during the medieval period to...
Okay, some of these Gospels I give you a list of, right? Some of these Gospels we know are analogia. The reason is because before fiction, okay? Before fiction, anything you wrote down had to be history or truth. No one had an idea about fiction, right? But people wanted information. And so especially in the medieval period, when there was a lot of people who were learning to read, and remember, this is so deep because, remember I told you, they started using, I don't know if I told you all this, but it's huge. Remember, all the Greek texts, they include vowels, but they don't have spaces. Some bright guy began doing teaching documents. And the teaching documents to teach students to read Greek, they separated the words. That way you didn't need a book slave. That way you didn't have to bring a book slave in to teach the kids. So they started doing what's called teaching texts. And guess what? you can read a teaching text, you can't read a regular Greek text. So what happened over time? As cost of materials went down, it suddenly became a good thing to put spaces between the words. As spaces came between the words, the average person could start to read stuff. Some bright guy got the idea, well, let's put in capitals, and let's put in paragraphs, and let's put in sentences. So by the medieval period, we're starting to see punctuation, spaces between words, and suddenly everybody could read it themselves. You didn't have to book slave, you didn't have somebody read it to you. So in the medieval period, suddenly there was a great desire for people to have
Stuff to read.
stuff to read. And we know that because what happened right in that period? The invention of the printing press, which then what were they printing? What was half of every document printed in Europe was
Bible.
Martin Luther's stuff. The Bible, you're right, the Bible was the primary book they were printing. They were printing 100% Bibles pretty much. But the stuff they were printing, 50% of all the written stuff that was printed was Martin Luther's tracts, his arguments, because people wanted something to read and there was no fiction. So what happened in this period, even before that, was people wanted to know. So they read, these were smart people. They read Tertullian, they read Justin Martyr, and somebody said, hey, wouldn't that be cool if we had that account? So somebody wrote it, right? Now, how do we know it's not true? We know it's not true because we have historical antecedent. We know there's, not enough documents. We know that the documents are late, etc., etc. And so we know those aren't accurate. How do we know these aren't? We don't. That's the point. These may be accurate documents. Matter of fact, let's talk about it a little bit. Constantine's letter in regard to the 50 bound copies, that's obvious, right? It's a letter that supports the 327, the Latin version of the Bible. Oh, it's Latin. I'm sorry. I must admit, it was in my notes. They produced 50 copies. We have copies of this. Eusebius referred to the letter in the copies. Ever mindful of the welfare of those churches of God, the emperor addressed me personally in a letter to do it. The letter of Melchior. Jonathan's interview with the Bethlehem shepherds. Letter of Melchior, priest of the synagogue. Sanhedrin. This is from the Sanhedrin. It's 88b, order number 2. It's in the Talmud. You know what I'm saying? It's in the Talmud. It's a Jewish document. Its a position of the shepherds is interesting in the Mishnah based on the described incident. The reason for this is a big deal in the Talmud is because this is why a non-hired shepherd cannot give a primary witness in a court of Jewish law. The shepherds were Levites in Bethlehem, and so that became a part of Talmudic law. It's in the Talmud. It's in the Sanhedrin.
Because they thought because of the first Christmas story that shepherds weren't reliable because they were making up stuff? Is that what you're saying?
Okay, what does it say in Jewish law? You need what?
2 witnesses.
2 or 3, right? But 2 witnesses at least. The shepherds came, according to this letter, according to this the Jonathan's interview, the shepherds came to they were Levites. They were Levites, right? They were watching the shepherd, the lambs for the Passover, right? That's where they made their bucks, okay? And these shepherds came to the priest. That was Levite, they're the Aaronite priests. And they said, this is what happened. We are more than 2 witnesses. This is it. And what did they say?
You guys don't count?
You don't count. We're going to make a Talmudic ruling that if you are a non-hired shepherd, you're an independent shepherd, a Levite shepherd, your testimony does not ever count in law. So that means that if you're a shepherd and you testify before a Jewish court, it doesn't count, even if you have 3 witnesses or more. They put it in the Talmudic documents. If that, I tell my kids all the time, when I do the Christmas story, I'm going to probably remind them again when we do the Advent account, because that is doesn't that sound like a proof to you? That's a huge proof, okay? Gamaliel's interview. So Gamaliel, you know who Gamaliel was, right? The rabbi of rabbis. He was Paul's rabbi. And he was the guy. There were 4 rabbis. Who's a rabbi? A rabbi is a Pharisee. There were 4 Pharisees on the in the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is 70 guys. Everybody else was a Levite, basically a Sadducee. So you had 4 we know of in that period. Gamaliel went and interviewed Joseph and Mary and others concerning Jesus. The descriptions of Joseph, Mary, Jesus, Mary and Martha, sisters of Lazarus, and they are unflattering. Why would the Vatican keep that a little quiet? Because it's unflattering. Mother, the Mary of God, cannot be disparaged, all right? It's like I got in trouble when in Centurion, I correctly called Jesus what they called him in the period, a bastard. He had no father, right? And the Christian bookstores would not put my book in because I happen to use the term that's true for a non-Christian, right? Isn't that interesting? So anyway, people do not like, and the Vatican and the Catholics, well, we don't either. We don't like to hear disparaging things about Jesus. And so Gamaliel went and talked to Mary and Joseph. But you know what? Go back and reread Acts 5. Because in Acts 5, guess who's talking? Gamaliel. Gamaliel is quoted in Acts 5 about, remember, if it comes from God, then you can't stop it? Well, why do you think he made those comments? Apparently he made a letter, and in his letter he talks about some of those things. Interesting. Caiaphas on the execution of Jesus. The report of Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin. Why would that be a big deal? Remember when we studied this in Mark. We studied this in Matthew. We've not done in Luke yet, but in the Gospels I think I talked about it. Why would this be a big deal? What did Caiaphas do that was bad?
That one man should die, then the whole nation. I mean, wasn't that his quote?
Yeah, that's his quote, but he did something really illegal. He did 3 or 4 illegal things.
He had a trial in the middle of the night,
He had a trial in the middle of the night,
closed court.
closed court, not the full Sanhedrin, right? And he pronounced death, which was illegal. And so they had to go and ask somebody to help him. Pilate, right? So what do you think happened when the whole Sanhedrin heard that? What would you do? Let's say you're one of the Sanhedrin, and old Caiaphas, the high priest, does something in the name of the Sanhedrin that results in the execution of Jesus Christ, who the whole of the nation of Israel purports to be a savior. Could you give that in triplicate by tomorrow? Wouldn't you? What would you do? I would. If you really did a bad mistake at work, would your boss ask you to write down what you did so that he would know the ramifications? I'm just saying, this is obvious stuff. But there's a letter in that Caiaphas report to the Sanhedrin concerning the execution of Jesus. Caiaphas' accusations. According to that document, he knew the name of God. Why is that a big deal? Only one person knew the name of God. Or, well, a small group. That was who?
The high priest.
The high priest. The priest knew the name of God, but nobody else was supposed to, right? So that in Psalm 118, when the high priest was supposed to say the name of God, he said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh." He would go, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh." Jesus knew the name of God. And remember, he said it. Remember, Mark? I am. That's a transliteration in Greek of Yahweh. He was saying Yahweh, but they wouldn't write that in the Greek. There's no way. Right? You can write what he says in Aramaic, but you can't write the name of God. Period. These people were Jews. He said atonement through repentance. Menonete instead of kafar. Atonement through repentance instead of atonement through
Works. Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, yes. It's penance through sacrifice, but we know that the sacrifice doesn't work for intentional sin. He said baptism instead of circumcision. This is in Caiaphas' letter. He said communion, bread and wine in place of the Passover. Although we already can see this may be a late date document.
Yeah.
because we didn't get that until John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom is the one who gave us the bread and the thing. Prophecy of the destruction of the temple. In Caiaphas' report, he talks about, Caiaphas writes about the healing miracles, the doctrine of Hillel, the teachings, talks about a singular God, he claimed to be God, and the Midrash teaching style. Remember I told you the differences between the Jewish and the Greek teaching styles, right? Really irritated. You would not believe how that irritated the Jewish rabbis of the time. That's not the way they taught, and they did not like it. Notes illegality of under the Jewish law of death pronounced without the Sanhedrin, which is interesting because what does that mean?
The Sanhedrin wasn't really going along with it?
It was illegal.
Well, it's illegal, but it means, okay, we have this view that we are so sophisticated and we understand what's going on. It shows that they knew, okay, even if this is a late day document, let's say 300 AD, it shows they were perceptive to all these details, right? It wasn't something new invented. It just existed. Caiaphas on the resurrection of Jesus. Report to Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin concerning the resurrection. This is, okay, the other one is not a Talmudic document. This is in Sanhedrin 89 by Serafi 2:7. The witness of the soldiers, John, Peter, Mary, and Joanna. Jesus' appearance to Caiaphas. Caiaphas' resignation. The report on the execution is more believable. The report on the resurrection is slightly questionable, but it's worth reading. Valerius' notes. Valerius Paterculus, the Roman historian, works thought to be lost but referenced by Priscian and Tacitus, contemporaries of Christ, known to have written the Historia Romana, but not extant. The notes are found in the Vatican about it. The reports to have met Jesus, about healing, raising from the dead, called him dangerous as an army, as a guy. Acts of Pilate. Now, Acts of Pilate are questionable documents. Acte Pilate, it's a Latin thing, or Pilate's report to Caesar, or the arrest, trial, and execution of Jesus. To Tiberius Caesar, it's a correct title and the correct Caesar. There are many details, likely too many. It's Pilate's first sight of Jesus, interview with Jesus. There's too much introspection in the document. Historically known that Pilate wrote a report to the Roman Senate, but this is not likely it. It's still worth reading. Herod in Bethlehem. Herod Antipas' defense before the Roman Senate in regard to his conduct at Bethlehem is found in the Vatican, negatively describes the Essenes, the priests, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. What's really interesting is, okay, the Essenes, right? I told you, the Essenes were probably the most important group in this whole thing, but they're not mentioned in any of the Gospels, which would imply that who wrote the Gospels? The Essenes. The Essenes probably wrote it, and Paul probably ignored them because they all mention the Pharisees, Sadducees, but not the Essenes. Not the Zealots much. The Zealots are mentioned a little bit. Anyway, I think it's very interesting. Refers to the milker and the shepherds. Interesting. Herod and John the Baptist. Herod Antipas' defense before the Roman Senate in regard to the execution of John the Baptist. Records of the records of the Roman Senate in the Vatican. To Tiberius and the Roman Senate. They're correct. In other words, the titles are correct. Herod's defeat by Artis. It talks about Herod's defeat by Artis, the king of Arabia. The reason for the defeat was attributed by the Jews to the bedhanging of John the Baptist. Here's something we don't get. Okay, historically, we know, remember, I told you, they always ask, well, what other documents prove Jesus? Well, guess what? There are many other documents. As a matter of fact, the Jews themselves said they thought that Herod Antipas lost the battle, which, by the way, ended up ruining the career of one of his sons, I think, in that battle. But have you ever studied it or heard about it? Right? Not even in history. Big deals. Okay? Herod John the Baptist. Herod's accusations against John the Baptist. No authority. Changes God's place of worship. Changes Jewish doctrines. Changes the mode of application. Refers to Gamaliel, Hilidrim, Samurai, and Hillel. They're the key rabbinical leaders. Why is it so big deal that there's Gamaliel, Hilidrim, Samurai, and Hillel? Why is that a big deal?
Is that the four?
They're the four. Yeah, they are the four members of the Sanhedrin that were Pharisees and rabbis. The others are priests. We know it because of other documents, the Talmudic documents, but it's repeated. Now, riddle me this, Batman. A really, really, really smart Christian who knew a lot about Jewish writings might be able to write this. Remember what I said? How many Talmudic scholars do you know that are Christians? You may be able to count them on your hands. I'm just saying, there's interesting stuff. Hillel III. Hillel's letters regarding God's providence to the Jews by Hillel III. This is 359 AD, so they're late. Nothing new, but a call to the Jewish people concerning the coming of the Messiah. You see what this is? This is a letter by a Jew about the coming of Christ in the time of Constantine, just before the time of Constantine. Messianic Jew. Okay, you know why this was subverted, right? This is probably a true letter, but why is it subverted? What did Martin Luther think about the Jews? He's not happy. What did Constantine think about the Jews? He wasn't very happy. What did the Christians think about the Jews? And, right? You see this, right? This is like a thing. And by the way, a lot of the Jewish people became Christians. We know that's Messianic Jewish, right? We know that from the New Testament. So, pretty interesting stuff. So, the conclusions about the Archko documents. I think they're worth reading. We need the originals to draw any real conclusions about the historical documents. There are external issues. We can clearly see they are not on the same historical footing as the canonical books of the New Testament, right? We can see that. But, hey, wouldn't you have loved it if your teacher had pulled this out when you were in, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, I don't care, high school, and said, these exist. We know there's reasons why they're not, potentially the greatest historical documents, but they exist. Would that have affected your faith? And I hate the word use faith. Would that have affected how convinced you are about Jesus? Right? I mean, right now we're having a problem. You know what the problem is, right? The problem? Young people are falling away from Christianity. I believe the problem is they have not been taught Christianity. They've been taught some kind of theological stuff, but they don't know the history of Christianity. They don't understand that Christianity is self-proving from a historical context. And I got lots of documents in history to prove it, right? So if I could give a single kid, like when I tell my children and grandchildren, I try to bring these things in as spiritual concepts. And you know what? They're true concepts. No one can dispute that the Talmudic documents support a bunch of this stuff. They're in the Talmud. So what are you going to do? Dispute with the rabbis? Go talk to your rabbis, right? I'm just saying, these are incredibly important documents for Christianity, even though they may have some, not perfect historical antecedents. And by the way, if we were continuing, what would we study? The historical antecedents of the other documents. And I guarantee you there are no documents most of the documents that we have that we use for history don't meet the criteria that these do. These meet a higher criteria than most of the stuff that you study to learn about history in the ancient period. I guarantee you. So, anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
You can Google it, it's for free. I'm on page 70.